So today we'll be talking about recent developments regarding legalized marijuana in the workplace. I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect of COVID and what we're seeing out there, and how that relates to marijuana in the workplace, and some recent developments, and also what we anticipate we'll be seeing, at least on the state level with Ohio and other states, and then some federal legislation. And we will, there's a lot to talk about actually, and some recent developments. So first of all, business is booming. It continues to boom regarding not only medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana as well. It is the marijuana business is projected to be, this year $16.3 billion, and only going up. It's projected to be a $40 billion industry in the very near future, and I think it might hit that $40 billion number certainly before 2024, which are the estimates. So I thought this was a nice little fact that the average price of marijuana per ounce is $320, and that actually fluctuates depending on which state you're in. So as far as Ohio goes, we now have 52 licensed dispensaries in the state. There have been nearly 170,000 recommendations. Remember, there's no prescribing marijuana because it's still an illegal substance pursuant to federal law. So we don't talk about marijuana in terms of prescriptions, even medical marijuana. We talk about doctors recommend marijuana. So we talk about recommendations. You don't have you don't prescribe marijuana and pick it up at the pharmacy. Doctors recommend it. So there's 131,000 registered patients, and again 170,000 recommendations. This is to date under Ohio's program, and there's currently 670 physicians in Ohio that have applied for and received certificates to recommend medical marijuana. Now, to the north of us, the state up north has over 300 licenses that they've issued, and that's for growers, processors, and retailers. They have both medical and recreational marijuana. So Michigan has been dealing with medical marijuana for quite some time now, and now they are also dealing with recreational marijuana. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those numbers next. So as far as our medical marijuana sales in Ohio, this is the latest statistics as of that I could pull as of really today. We have sold or distributed over 21,000 pounds of plant material and over 1 million units of manufactured product. We're not just talking about plants, we're also talking about other types of marijuana products, edibles and gummy bears. We'll get into all that. And this is, since Ohio's program has been up and running, over $176 million in sales of medical marijuana. Okay, now this is just Ohio. This might seem like a lot, but these are very, very small numbers when you compare them to the states that have recreational marijuana as well as medicinal marijuana. For instance, I just pulled Michigan's numbers, and Michigan had over $60 million in sales of recreational marijuana last month, and over $50 million in sales of medical marijuana last month. So it gives you some kind of idea of the scale and scope of and the money involved with respect to both legal medical marijuana and legal recreational marijuana. Colorado, for instance, had $226 million in sales of marijuana in July alone. Over $1.2 billion in sales in Colorado this year, 2020 already, which translates to over $200 million in tax revenues for the state. So marijuana is really, really big business in many of these states: Michigan, Colorado, California. It's one of California's largest industries, and now Illinois. Illinois has had legalized marijuana since January of this year, and they just had $64 million in sales last month. So big business, a lot of money involved, and obviously a lot of people involved trying to get a piece of the pie. And obviously the governments are no exception, because the state governments want the revenue, right? The tax revenue, so they can spend it. As far as Ohio legislative activities, not only do we have this, the sales of medical marijuana under Ohio statutory program, but also there's a lot of efforts, not only throughout Ohio, but throughout the country in municipalities at the state level, and we'll see even at the federal level, to totally decriminalize marijuana. Some municipalities have gone as far as they believe they can legally go to decriminalize marijuana, and also to expunge prior convictions. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And also to broaden the range of uses in Ohio of medical marijuana, the conditions that you can have a recommendation. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but here's a screen of at least some legislative activity. Ohio did try to put recreational, there was a ballot initiative to get recreational marijuana on the ballot this November, and that initiative failed because the ballot language was rejected by the Ohio Attorney General. So Ohio won't have legalized recreational marijuana on the ballot this November, may in the future, and but other states, will go through some other states that do. Marijuana spending is projected to increase over 30% this year. Studies are showing that during the COVID pandemic, there's been an increased use, both higher doses and use in greater frequency. And again, we saw how much money is involved in the marijuana business itself. So a lot of states and even the federal government are now saying, this is an untapped source of revenue for us that, we need. And I'll talk a little bit about what went on in Pennsylvania yesterday on that note in a couple other slides. But it seems like some of the stay-at-home orders were hurting the marijuana business. Michigan and Colorado and California in particular, because although the marijuana business was declared in most states an essential business, people were having trouble getting out pursuant to the state stay-at-home orders and actually going to these retail stores and getting their marijuana. A lot of our clients have expressed issues with their drug testing programs and during COVID. In other words, it's hard to collect samples as far as your drug-free programs. Testing facilities were shut down for a while, so people that were supposed to get pre-employment tests, random tests, for cause tests, you couldn't bring those individuals in to get tests for a while. Now, I think we're opening up a little bit, and those testing facilities are back online for the most part. But for a while there, employers were having difficulties with their administering their drug-free programs because after an accident, we needed to get our employees go for post-accident testing or for cause testing, and then you would have to transport those individuals because if they're had an accident or they're suspected of using marijuana and exhibiting the signs of marijuana intoxication, you have to take those individuals to a testing facility. The testing facility isn't open because of COVID, and they weren't, having patient interactions and weren't doing, drug testing. Then you couldn't take the patient there, and then you had to get that person there. So the supervisor had to take those individuals if they weren't being taken by, ambulance because of an injury. And then the supervisors had to engage in social distancing pursuant to the company's COVID policies to try to get those individuals there. And sometimes the supervisors just had a truck. And then how do you social distance when you just had a truck without any sort of back seat that you could transport those individuals? So we had a lot of clients that were having some difficulties, especially early on during the pandemic. And any employees that fall under the Department of Transportation's drug testing programs, so anyone with a CDL license, those individuals, you have to have a 50% random test rate, and you also have to have a pre-employment test before any of those individuals could be assigned a safety sensitive job function. So a lot of our clients were having real difficulties getting people tested. You couldn't assign people to safety sensitive positions, and a lot of our clients that are in essential businesses actually were hurting for individuals. They needed to get individuals in the door, and they really needed and still do. They need good employees because they have business to do. They just need more employees to do those. So these are presenting some obstacles and still presenting some obstacles, but certainly early on, as far as collecting samples, complying with the DOT regs about in-person, assessment, doing in-person assessments. The DOT relaxed the regulations somewhat, and there is some flexibility there, saying that, look, if you can't get people tested for alcohol within 8 hours after an accident, or drug tested within 32 hours, which are the requirements, then you just have to keep documentation of why that test didn't occur. And for your random tests, why you couldn't get the appropriate number of people tested in time. You need to create a record and documentation to show that, look, we tried going to this test facility. They weren't doing testing at the time. We went to this alternate test facility. They weren't doing testing, and we were able to get people tested, but it might have been after the deadline, the statutory deadline, but these were the links we went to actually comply with the requisite requirements under the DOT's policy. So you need to create that documentation, keep that documentation as to why you may not have been able to follow those DOT rules or your own policies regarding drug testing. Again, this is 30 states deemed at least dispensing medical marijuana as an essential business during the pandemic. And this is Ohio's language. Thought this was interesting that during April, 420 is obviously a big celebration day for marijuana advocates, and even normal, the marijuana, probably the largest pro-marijuana group in the country, encouraged their consumers, marijuana consumers, not to congregate outdoors or indoors and be respectful of the rules regarding not attending mass gatherings. So, and oh, by the way, there's a lot of studies out there on marijuana and COVID, and clearly folks that vape and smoke marijuana are more susceptible to COVID related issues. Of course, there's other studies out there that say that marijuana in other forms actually helps reduce inflammation associated with COVID. So you could find a study for whatever side of the issue you're on, but it looks like most of the studies are saying not recommending smoking or vaping marijuana during COVID. So during COVID, some folks had to get a little bit creative to get their medical marijuana. So in DC, allowed dispensaries to actually deliver cannabis and provide curbside, pickup, so people could still get their medical marijuana through delivery drivers. And so I guess you could get your pizza and your cannabis at the same time. And then also San Francisco entrepreneurs were accepting Bitcoin from people for marijuana purchases, and developed a drone was in the process of being developed for the delivery drone. So I thought this was creative and very entrepreneurial. So now we could have our drones delivering our medical marijuana or recreational marijuana, right, during the COVID crisis. So future of, I guess that's, it's future of Amazon, right? We'll start getting things delivered via drones, and probably not too far off. So this is just a chart of the states with legalized medical marijuana. These are the states with legalized recreational marijuana currently. So again, the big ones as far as sales: California, Colorado. Now Illinois is moving into those high sales category. Michigan is big in terms of sales. So the sort of pro-legalization marijuana crowd is touting a lot of jobs, that there's allegedly 250,000 marijuana industry jobs out there, and projections for another million jobs out there if federal legislation passes legalizing marijuana. So you have employment employment issues. Although I think now a lot of businesses might see that as sort of competition for the limited pool of workers that are out there as well. But so a lot of jobs and a lot of money to be had with medical and recreational marijuana. This November, we're looking at some other ballot initiatives in other states. So New Jersey has a ballot initiative, and I think it looks like maybe a close call there, but so we'll see what happens in November with some of these ballot initiatives. So New Jersey, recreational marijuana ballot initiative. Arizona, another close call, I think, in Arizona. Recreational marijuana. Mississippi has one, a ballot initiative for medical marijuana. Montana for recreational. South Dakota is interesting because they don't have any legalized marijuana right now, and they have two ballot initiatives, sort of a two-part ballot initiative, one for medicinal and one for recreational. They could actually go and have it legal for both reasons in one election. Usually people start like Ohio did with medical marijuana, like Michigan did with medical marijuana, and then use that as sort of a foothold, and then have a recreational ballot and ballot initiative. So I thought this was interesting. So if we go back and look at New Jersey, has a recreational marijuana initiative on the ballot, and then in neighboring Pennsylvania, just this week, the governor and lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania were out there at these a lot of pro-marijuana rallies, supporting the pro-marijuana group and basically reacting to this New Jersey legislation and saying, my gosh, if New Jersey has legalized recreational marijuana, we've talked about the money, Colorado's getting $200 million a year in tax revenue for legalized marijuana. Pennsylvania's saying, well, wait a minute, that's revenue that we could have where everyone's going to be going to New Jersey. And so I think that's probably the big issue, is the money issue. Of course, then just yesterday, I saw this quote from the lieutenant governor that couches the issue as sort of a pride thing, right? We're Pennsylvania farmers. We could certainly grow better marijuana than those darn, New Jersey. What do they know about growing marijuana? But ultimately, I think the real issue is money, despite the lieutenant governor puffing out his chest about the Pennsylvania farmers being better than New Jersey farmers. So another of other trends out there, one of the trends is that older Americans are starting to use marijuana for anxiety relief and sleep aids. So the demographic of who's using it is shifting. Clearly, the great majority of the individuals that are using marijuana are in the 18 to 29 category. Those are the biggest users of marijuana, but some older Americans are now starting to use marijuana too. Entrepreneurs are getting creative with products. So you see a picture of a dark chocolate 420 bar, so with medical marijuana, and dark chocolate popping blackberry, so 4.2 grams of medical cannabis. And then obviously some tinctures that you can mix with your tea or coffee, lozenges, gummies as well. I've seen some creative microbreweries combining marijuana with their with beer, infusing marijuana and other alcoholic drinks with beer, or infusing beer and other alcoholic beverages with marijuana. We're seeing new testing developments out there. One of the problems that we have in the workplace with regard to marijuana is that if you have a policy that just talks in terms of impairment, not just presence testing, most of our policies just talk about in terms of testing positive for marijuana. But if your policy doesn't just talk in terms of testing positive, but also talks about in terms of, well, you can't be impaired in the workplace. Well, we can measure that with alcohol. We're used to measuring that with alcohol. The police have a way to measure that with alcohol. They do breathalyzer tests and can determine the alcohol content of your breath, of your blood alcohol content. But we really don't have a way to determine, quote, impairment We can observe signs of marijuana impairment in the workplace, but this is one of the problems. That's why when you're testing, your test levels are just measuring the presence of cannabinoids in your system. They aren't measuring an impairment level. So you have an initial cutoff level, which is usually 50 nanograms per milliliter, and then a subsequent level for a split test sample. So they retest that sample, and if there's above, usually it's 15 nanograms per milliliter, that just confirms the presence of cannabinoids in your system. It doesn't confirm anything about whether or not you were impaired at the time. So that's why employers need to be real careful that they aren't trying to prove impairment. You're not trying to prove that employees are impaired. You're informing them that you have a drug testing policy and a drug-free workplace, and if you test positive, that means that that marijuana is present in your system. And we don't have to go and prove impairment. Now, the police might have to, and when they're talking about impairment, but there have really been no great tests up to this point to sort of measure impairment. We're just starting to get entrepreneurs and labs developing these tests so that the police could possibly measure for impairment, and which would measure the THC levels. THC, obviously, really the chemical that causes marijuana intoxication, right? So that's one of the things to watch out for, are these, testing for impairment levels and testing for THC levels, and that's in the future. So all of our policy should say, we're not going down the road to proving impairment. We don't care about that. We just know that you have violated our policy because you have marijuana in your system and you tested positive. Okay? So the basis of our drug testing policies and in why we can prohibit just testing positive for marijuana, even though it's so-called, it's legal in all these states from a recreational standpoint and a medicinal standpoint, is that marijuana is still illegal as a matter of federal law under the Controlled Substances Act. So it's still listed as a Schedule I drug, and it's still illegal as a matter of federal law. Now, if that changes, we have a brand new ball game, and then we will have to have another one of these presentations in light of that change, if marijuana is removed as a Schedule I drug under the Uniform Controlled Substances Act. Okay, and of course, the Department of Transportation has very stringent drug testing programs that we talked about, and in Department of Transportation has reaffirmed that we're driving vehicles, and we are not going to be going down the path to allowing legalized medical or legalized marijuana anytime soon. So, okay, that being said, here is where we are on the federal level. There have been a number of initiatives introduced by Congress over the last few years to legalize marijuana, to take marijuana off of the Schedule I under the Controlled Substances Act. This is the latest and greatest piece of legislation. It's called the MORE Act, which Jerry Nadler, from Democrat from New York, is the sponsor of the House version, and Vice President candidate Harris is the sponsor of the companion Senate bill. So obviously, elections matter, and Joe Biden has said that if he becomes president, that he favors this kind of legislation now. And obviously his vice presidential candidate is a sponsor of this legislation. this legislation was actually scheduled, they were trying to schedule it for a vote before Congress recessed on October 2nd. And just yesterday, it looks like even the Democrat, it has over 100 supporters in the House. So, so this was going to be voted on before October 2nd, when Congress adjourns for their electioneering, and then they don't return back to Congress until after the election. And just yesterday, even the Democrats said, some Democrats convinced other Democrats that, look, we're not gonna vote on this prior to October 2nd. So we may see it after the elections, though. We may see a vote on this in the House for sure. The Senate, as it's currently composed, isn't going to take up this legislation anytime soon. But who knows what happens, early next year after the elections, depending on the composition of the Senate. So, so this is out there. This legislation would remove cannabis from the schedule, period, of controlled substances. It would no longer be illegal as a matter of federal law. The legislation would also mandate that the Bureau of Labor Statistics maintain and compile information, demographic information, on who owns these marijuana businesses, marijuana-related businesses, and who works in marijuana-related businesses. And that demographic information would include age, race, national origin. And then, and you'll see why that's important, because there would be then a new tax on cannabis sales, and that new tax would go into a big trust fund, and they would establish a cannabis justice office, so a new federal bureaucracy to administer this trust fund, and that would be funded by marijuana-related taxes, and then so-called disadvantaged groups under the legislation would then be able to apply to this trust fund to get marijuana businesses and to get this trust fund money for their particular communities. Also, the legislation would specifically expunge prior cannabis convictions that for people that aren't currently being under a sentence or being incarcerated. So those marijuana-related convictions will be gone. And then it would review current sentences, so people could go ahead and bring those before hearing officers and get those sentences either eliminated or commuted. So this legislation would represent just a huge, huge change from where we are now, sort of the opposite of where we are now with our federal law regarding marijuana. So again, federal government recognizing there's a lot of money in this industry, and also wants to get their hands on some of the money for taxes. Also, there's this really this notion about decriminalizing marijuana that is sort of permeating through our local communities and up to the state levels, and now the federal government levels. So keep an eye out for that. Again, that passes, and we're coming back for another one of these. So let's talk a little bit about where we are with hemp and CBD. So at the end of 2018, we had some federal farm bill amendments that basically paved the way for hemp to be grown and used and not be declared illegal. So hemp is a cannabis plant it looks just like marijuana, but it has 0.3% less or less THC content. So it doesn't get you high, and hemp is used in a number of, has a number of industrial and a number of industrial commercial uses. So this legislation clarified that, look, if we're not going to classify hemp, which again is 0.3% or less THC content, as marijuana or cannabis, and therefore it's not illegal. So this is when we had the boom, and then also, and then most every state, I think there was only one state that was sort of an outlier, but then all the states, like Ohio, passed their own laws saying, okay, now that the federal government legalized hemp or excluded it from the definition of illegal marijuana, we, the state of Ohio and other states, are also going to allow products with hemp to be made and not illegal. And so this is where we get this so-called CBD industry cropping up, because CBD oil is not, CBD products are not supposed to be, have legal CBD products, do not have more than 0.3% THC content. This is why you have, you could go to the Family Video store down the street and they have a big sign saying, get your CBD here. And there's a lot of businesses that sell CBD and tout it as legal, as a legal product. And it is, if the content is 0.3% or less THC. Again, how do you regulate that? How do you know? The FDA doesn't get involved in regulating these types of products. So you have to be very careful when you use those. This is the Ohio legislation. I put this slide up there because the Ohio legislation decriminalized so-called hemp, but it's very difficult to differentiate hemp from marijuana because they look the same. So if someone has a truckload of hemp or marijuana, if you're the police, how do you figure that out? So the only way that you used to be able to figure it out is that there were only a couple different testing facilities in Ohio. You could go to the BCI labs and send a sample to them, and then you'd have to wait for the results to come back, and then the local law enforcement would actually have to pay the state to test the substance as to whether it's marijuana or hemp. So the local police were like, wait a minute, we're using up our money to test whether this is hemp or marijuana. So they were only doing it in instances where they had a very large quantity of this product or plant that they intercepted. So now we're starting to get field tests for the police where they could actually field test what the THC content, and if it's over the 0.3%, then it's illegal marijuana. And if it's under the 0.3 and someone says, hey, I'm just transporting legal hemp, and they could field test it, and okay, looks like it's legal hemp and you're using it for other types of purposes, or if you're using it to make CBD type products, then that's legal. So I thought this was interesting too for any folks in the construction industry that we now have all these green initiatives out there, and so people are marketing their green hempcrete product. So these can't get any greener than that. And oh, by the way, the Romans used to use hemp in their concrete products to make, the Romans probably the best builders of roads and bridges, and they used hempcrete. So there are these products out there for businesses now that are saying, look, we want to be green, and we want to use sustainable materials, and this is a good way for businesses to sort of get involved in that, either purchasing that or people that are manufacturing that. So there's a number of businesses out there that primarily produce these types of products for building. So let's get back into Ohio's law again. We'll shift gears about our medical marijuana. These are all the qualifying conditions that medical marijuana can be recommended in Ohio. So a lot of different conditions, including fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, but also some catch-alls in there. Pain that is chronic and severe or intractable. So you could have somebody just going to one of these 670 physicians that can recommend medical marijuana, and basically just say, look, I have chronic pain, and they just write them a recommendation, and they can get a 90-day supply of medical marijuana that, in terms of plant material, although obviously in Ohio you can't smoke it, but in terms of plant material, amounts to about I think I figured it out, was about 3 joints a day if you were to smoke it for your 90 days. So also other diseases can be added. So we see that people apply to the pharmacy board that determines whether or not these conditions should be allowed. Depression, anxiety, autism. So a number of these conditions, the boards are looking at the current medical information and saying, do we have medical studies that definitively show that medical marijuana would help these conditions? So so we could add the condition to this list. So we see those periodically. So autism, insomnia, Browns fans. So someone actually had an application and petition to put Browns or Bengals fan as one of these conditions on the list. So I may actually have to take this slide off of these presentations in the future, given the Browns victory yesterday. Now Monday, I would have said it. Monday, I would have said it deserves to be on there. But as of today, I can wear my Browns mask with pride. So again, now we're getting back into employment situations under Ohio's law. Probably the most employer-friendly, one of the most employer-friendly medical marijuana laws in the country. So the law specifically says that we do not have to permit or allow any kind of medical marijuana use, possession, or distribution. We don't have to allow medical marijuana as a reasonable accommodation under the state disability laws, and we can refuse to hire folks based upon their positive tests, regardless of whether they have a recommendation for medical marijuana or not. We can enforce our zero tolerance drug policy. So anyone that has a positive test and brings their recommendation to us, that's not a defense under Ohio law, and a positive test is just cause under Ohio's unemployment system for denying unemployment. So again, these are very employer-friendly provisions. So we have to make some calls, though, on on these issues as employers. So I've been getting a lot of calls on this where someone will say, look, I really want to hire this individual. They have, you know, a specific condition that falls under the list. They were upfront about it. They said they were taking medical marijuana. They gave me their recommendation and are asking, you know, if we should, you know, can accommodate them under our policies and allow them to take the marijuana. And oh, by the way, they're only taking it, you know, at night to sleep and will not take it during the day and will not possess it during the day. And there'll be at least a, you know, 5 to 8 hour gap between the time they take it, or 10-hour gap between the time they take it and the time they come to work. Can we hire them? So those are some tough questions that we're working through with our clients now, because again, our clients are having a hard time finding good qualified employees for certain positions. And after all, those individuals are at least upfront about the fact that they have a condition. This is, they're taking this, it's helpful for their condition. They have a recommendation from a physician. So those are interesting discussions that we're having, and much different discussions than we had with our clients 5 years ago. You know, our clients 5 years ago, when they were dealing with, you know, people taking marijuana, they may get it from Michigan or wherever and saying it, you know, helped. Our clients were almost universally saying, no, we're not modifying our drug testing policies or procedures or drug-free workplace policies. We're not allowing anyone to do that. Now some clients are reconsidering and saying, okay, in certain circumstances, you know, we may, you know, waive that requirement for this individual, and then we have to be careful about the effect of, you know, others. Michigan marijuana, under Michigan's marijuana law, this is one of the most marijuana, you know, Ohio's medical marijuana law is one of the most employer-friendly medical marijuana laws in the country. And Michigan's marijuana update is one of the most pro marijuana laws in the country. The recreational marijuana. You can have up to 2.5 ounces of marijuana on your person. That's a crazy amount of marijuana. It's a large quantity of marijuana to be carrying around, and you can grow up to 12 plants, which are more plants than any other state allows you to grow at home. And you can, I like this provision, you can gift up to 2.5 ounces. So you can't sell it, but you can gift it to people. So, gives new meaning to the old Joe Cocker song, high with a little help from my friends, right? So gifting your friends up to 2.5 ounces. So retail stores are in business and open in Michigan, and we talked about how much money that's bringing in, over $60 million last month for just recreational marijuana alone. Indiana is still sort of holding out. So you can use CBD oil for medical purposes. Of course, that has to be no more than 0.3% THC content. Illinois, we talked a little bit about, that became legal. Their law went into effect on January of this year. And what did I say? That they were already had in the last month over $60 million in sales, and within the last month of marijuana. So their law also contains some provisions that are kind of they're similar to provisions in the MORE Act about pardons for prior marijuana-related convictions, expungements, and decriminalization of marijuana-related offenses. So there's a number of different state law issues out there. I just wanted to talk briefly. I don't have much time left, but I want to talk briefly about a case that came out in of a Tennessee district court, federal district court in Tennessee this week, because Tennessee is within the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals for federal law. And if this case goes up to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, that whatever the court says will apply to us in Ohio. And again, with these state law issues, what you have to remember is all these states are different. So you really, if you do business in other states, you really have to know the state laws and all these other states, how they view marijuana. They have their own laws. Michigan's different than Ohio's, that's different than Indiana's, that's different than Illinois. So, but this case in Tennessee was, there was a municipal worker who wanted to apply for a promotion, and she knew that as part of the promotion, she would have to undergo a drug test. And she tested positive for marijuana and ultimately resigned because they said they're going to fire her as a result of the positive test. She indicated to her supervisor prior to this that she was taking CBD for fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome and anxiety. She didn't think that from her reading up on CBD, that she was going to test positive, because if it's truly legal CBD, it's less than 0.3% THC, and it'll be very rare that you could pop a positive test if you're just using CBD that's legal, that doesn't fall under the definition of marijuana because it has such just basic trace amounts of THC. And ultimately, again, she resigned, filed a lawsuit, and said, look, I was taking this for my chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. She filed charges with the EEOC. She filed a disability discrimination under the ADA and Tennessee law. So this is very similar to some of the situations that we're seeing with our clients. People are taking CBD or medical marijuana with a recommendation and asking for accommodations. The Tennessee court granted summary judgment to the municipality and said, no, it's not a reasonable accommodation under these circumstances for that municipality to have to revise or allow someone to be taking CBD, even though the employee thought it was legal CBD, under the Americans with Disabilities Act or Tennessee law. So a good decision for employers, but we're going to see more and more and more of those exact cases. So when employers run into those, they have to be very, very cautious about state laws, about what some of these federal courts are saying. And again, typically, if individuals are buying a legal CBD product that certifies that they're under 0.3% THC, it's very common for doctors or physical therapists to actually tell individuals to use CBD with respect to certain conditions, certain injuries, even sprains, strains, knee problems. Orthopedic doctors have people rubbing CBD oil on their knees. So people have to realize that typically this would not pop a positive on a drug test, but you have to make sure that you're taking the right product, and the FDA isn't regulating it. So there's always some sort of risk, but the studies show that usually you'd have to use just a huge quantity of one of these legal products to pop a positive. So typically that's not a good excuse. So just be careful about that issue because it's coming up in our workplaces. Under workers' comp, if you're under the influence of marijuana and the marijuana intoxication causes the injury, and we get a doctor to say that, we can win those and deny the comp claim under those circumstances. And this notion of payment for medical marijuana under workers' comp. Right now, the marijuana is an illegal drug. It's not approved by the US FDA. It's not prescription, so pharmacies don't prescribe it, and so the BWC only reimburses for approved drugs, prescription drugs, and drugs that are on the pharmaceutical formulary. So Ohio BWC doesn't pay for that, but if you have employees and workers' comp coverage in other states, you have to be careful about this one too, because in New Jersey, an employer has to reimburse employee for cost of medical marijuana if a doctor says it's needed to treat the work-related condition. So states are all over the map on this one too. Again, be careful. So I'm right about at an hour now. So I do just want to make a point, kind of funny, and I thought this slide was good because what's on the horizon? Well, let's keep an eye on the MORE Act, keep an eye on some of the state laws and see where we're going with this. Watch out, make sure our policies are revised to make sure that they prohibit the use of, in Ohio, of medical marijuana too, regardless if someone recommends it. Take a good look at some of these issues. If they're brought to you by your employee, do we want to go ahead and have that employee work if they're upfront about they have this recommendation to treat this condition? And magic mushrooms could be next. There's some city councils and local municipalities, I think one of them's in Denver, that are now trying to get the use of hallucinogenic mushroom. I don't know, when I was in high school, we called them magic mushrooms. Get the use of magic mushrooms actually approved and legalized to treat certain conditions, just like how the sort of medical marijuana legalization efforts started. Now, I guess this is the next in the line of legalizing substances. So keep an eye on that too. So do we have any quick questions? I know I'm right at an hour here.
Yeah, Jennifer has a quick question. First of all, she wanted to know if you could address what legal means, considering marijuana is illegal as on the federal level, and then also what about employees who travel to a recreation use legal state, use while there, then return to work and are tested at a later time? How are these cases handled?
Yeah, so the first question is, okay, what's legal, what's not legal? Well, I mean, obviously each state has their own sort of definition, but Ohio has legal medicinal medical marijuana under Ohio law. So Ohio law specifically says that for purposes of Ohio's law, we're going to say that marijuana is not a Schedule I drug. But marijuana is with an above a 0.3 THC content is illegal currently as a matter of federal law. So it is not a legal substance. It's on the controlled substances list as a Schedule I drug that is illegal. And now there are the caveat to that is there's two prescription drugs that contain marijuana. One is Marinol, and there's another one, it's called Dronabinol. And those two drugs do have some THC content and actual marijuana in them, but those are prescription drugs to treat certain medical conditions. So when people test positive, the medical review officer will ask those individuals if they're on those two drugs. If they're on those two prescription drugs, then that will not be considered a positive test. But otherwise, any sort of test where it confirms the presence of cannabinoids in your system it would be a violation of your policy. So again, legal for purposes of state law is a lot different than legal for purposes of federal law, and currently it is illegal. So the second question is, okay, you go to Colorado. Hey, I went to Colorado. It was legal in Colorado. Went there with my friends, smoked some pot, came back. It was perfectly legal. But then all of a sudden, I had a test, maybe a random test under the employer's drug testing policy. And my excuse for testing pot, I didn't know. You come back Monday, I smoked in Colorado where it was legal. And the answer to that is tough. You know, our policy says that if you test positive, we don't care the reason that you went to Colorado and smoked, you knew you were subject to a drug-free workplace. If you wanted to smoke a lot of pot in Colorado and come back to a job, then you need to get a job that doesn't have a drug-free workplace policy and drug testing that says if you test positive, you suffer the consequences of a positive test. So that's the short answer to that question. And we can enforce that in Ohio. It's just enforcing our drug testing policy.